In 1864, Lincoln is going to be facing a presidential election in November. Not only were there significant doubts whether Lincoln was going to be reelected, it was even unclear whether the Republican Party was going to nominate him as a presidential candidate for a second term. The Republican Party has been split now into two factions: radical emancipationists and abolitionists, and conservative gradualist unionists, who will eventually be called Union Republicans, while the other faction will be referred to as radical Republicans. We saw how throughout the previous year, Lincoln's Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, intrigued against Lincoln, attempting to position himself as a nominee for the presidency to lead the radical Republicans, and fostered deeper divisions within the Republican Party. But after he was exposed, Salmon Chase publicly withdrew his name as a possible candidate in March of 1864. Nonetheless, secretly, he continued to plot in the hope that suddenly something might go wrong for Lincoln, and he, Chase, would now be called upon to serve as a candidate for the presidency. His ambitious and powerful Treasury Department employees continued to devote their energy to assist their boss to scheme and campaign for Chase's candidacy. Chase turned his attention from Lincoln to instead now attacking a member of Lincoln's cabinet, a Montgomery or Monty Blair, Lincoln's postmaster general, by attacking Montgomery Blair's younger brother, Frank Blair, who was not only a congressman, but during the summer when Congress was in recess, he commanded a division in Sherman's army out west. He had fought at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, and during the winters, he would return to sit in Congress as a Free Soiler Party member from Kentucky and a supporter, of course, of the Lincoln administration. A Treasury agent investigator in Chase's Treasury Department was now accusing Frank Blair of swindling the U.S. government by charging $8,000 of liquor and tobacco expenses to a military account for his division. And he offered what seemed to be Treasury Department documents as proof of the charges. Frank Blair, as a member of Congress, demanded a congressional committee to investigate the charges against them. And the congressional committee discovered that Salmon P. Chase's Treasury agent had forged the incriminating documents. There was no evidence that Chase knew the details of this smear attempt on Frank Blair, but Frank Blair, just the same, waited quietly until the report came out publicly and was tabled in Congress. And then he rose to speak about it. On the day before Blair's scheduled departure to return to the battlefield in Sherman's army, Frank Blair got up and, after very calmly describing the report's findings of his innocence, unleashed an attack on Salmon P. Chase, saying, quote, These dogs have been set on me by their master, and since I have whipped them back into their kennel, I mean to hold their master responsible for this outrage and not the curs who have been set upon me." End of quote. He then went on to accuse Chase of corruption, disloyalty, and treachery against Lincoln, and a lack of patriotism and sordid ambitions for the presidency. Chase supporters immediately denounced Blair's speech, while Chase demanded that Lincoln punish Blair by canceling his commission in the Army. When Lincoln didn't do that, Chase threatened to resign. And this is the third time Chase will threaten to resign from Lincoln's cabinet as a way of forcing Lincoln to either compromise on an issue or give in on some issue that's important to Chase. Delegation of Chase supporters now corner Lincoln in his office, and they urge him to respond to Chase because Chase's resignation on the eve of election could hurt Lincoln politically already in an election where his re-election chances look pretty slim. Lincoln now reviews with this committee the two previous threats to resign that Chase had come forward with. Lincoln tells Chase supporters that he's appalled and offended by Blair's speech, but General Sherman needs Blair in his upcoming campaign. And so he urges the delegates to persuade Chase from resigning and forgiving Blair for the sake of the war effort. And so with his ego soothed, Salmon Chase will stay on for a little while longer. On the battlefield, in the meantime, after the Union victory at Chattanooga, Sherman is now left in charge of the campaign against Atlanta, while General Ulysses S. Grant is moved to the north, to the Eastern Theater. General Ulysses S. Grant will be promoted. In fact, a new rank will be created exclusively for him, Lieutenant General, and Ulysses S. Grant will now be as well appointed General-in-Chief of the United States Army overall in March of 1984. And Grant now also personally takes command of the Army of the Potomac, which is going to be facing now General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Tennessee in what's going to become known as the Overland Campaign to capture Richmond. And here you can see how the campaign is going to surround Richmond and actually drive towards Petersburg. Sometimes it's referred to as the Petersburg Campaign, and this will be the last campaign of the war. Here, Ulysses S. Grant is going to be facing almost in a duel Robert E. Lee. From the beginning, it doesn't go any better, as much as Lincoln hoped it would, for General Grant than it did for all the predecessor commanders of the Army of the Potomac, from McDowell to McClellan to Burnside. All of them are going to somehow fail and disappoint Lincoln. And as much as Lincoln hoped that he found in Grant a commander who somehow brings some kind of victory in the Northeast, it's not going well. In a series of battles between May and June of 1864, Grant's army will suffer perhaps as many as 65,000 casualties. The rate and intensity of the slaughter had been unprecedented. Arriving at this tangled, bushy area known as the Wilderness in Virginia in May, Grant's soldiers find themselves camping out on top of the bones of their own dead from a battle that they had been beaten in the very same place a year before. And camping out on the bones of your fellow soldiers dead does not bode well, as you can imagine. The Battle of the Wilderness will take place between May 5th to May 7th, 1864, and the Union at the Battle of the Wilderness will sustain 18,400 casualties to 11,400 Confederates. And so the Confederates prevail at the Battle of Wilderness. And then it's going to get worse. There'll be a battle at a crossroads named for a hotel standing there, Cold Harbor. The battle will take place between May 31st and June 12th, 1864. There's no harbor there, the harbor in terms of a hotel, a shelter being a harbor. This battle is going to be distinguished by a final suicidal assault by Union forces. Men in the forward ranks of the assault are pushed forward by those in the rear ranks into a wall of carefully laid Confederate rifle and artillery fire. As one historian described it, he said, Union soldiers were funneled like pigs into a slaughter pen. End of quote. Later, when the graves are dug up from this battle, which again will be a resounding defeat for the Union. In fact, this is the battle where in a period of just 20 minutes, some 7,000 Union soldiers were killed. Certainly a glimpse into the future battlefield slaughters of World War I. But years later, as these bodies after the war are recovered at Cold Harbor, one of the people working on disinterring these bodies discovers a blood-splattered diary in the pocket of one of the soldiers' rotting tunic. The pages of the diary are stuck together in dried blood. Curious as to what would be the last diary entry that this fallen soldier had made, they kind of unstick the pages and find the last entry that he had made before his death. And in it, there's only one sentence written, quote, "Today I was killed," end of quote. And so men knew that they were going to their deaths. They knew that they were not going to survive Cold Harbor. Some 13,000 Union troops will be slaughtered at Cold Harbor to 2,500 Confederate casualties. At Cold Harbor, Grant asked Lee for a 3-hour truce to remove his wounded from the battlefield. At Fredericksburg in 1862, Robert E. Lee had graciously allowed General Burnside to remove his Union wounded from beneath Marie's Heights, as long as Burnside did it under a flag of truce. At Cold Harbor, Lee makes the same offer to Grant. You can remove your wounded, but do it under a white flag of truce, symbolizing Grant's acknowledgement of defeat at Cold Harbor. Grant refused. Rather than admit to defeat, he let his wounded to die as a point of honor. This now disturbed Robert E. Lee, because now Robert E. Lee suddenly realized that Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, sometimes the nickname it was said that the U.S. stood for unconditional surrender, Grant. Grant would prefer and allow his men to die, his wounded men to die, rather than admitting defeat. And now Robert E. Lee realizes that he's facing a general of a kind of psychology that he had never faced before. He's unlike Burnside or the hesitant McClellan. This is a whole different thing, and it in some ways, Grant's refusal actually to some extent demoralizes Robert E. Lee, because he realizes now how desperate and bloody the war is becoming and will get. There's still a lot of killing on the way to come. By now, belligerents had stopped exchanging prisoners of war over the issue of Confederates' treatment of African American POWs. And previously in the war, what would happen if you were captured as a POW, you would be paroled back home. You had to give your word, your parole, that you would not rejoin the military and would retire from the fighting, but otherwise you would be allowed to go home. Now, because of African American soldiers on the field and all the controversy about whether they will be enslaved if they're captures, as per to the as well the order of retaliation that I had described in a previous lecture. Both sides now begin holding their prisoners in camps rather than releasing them. And these camps, although not intentionally brutal, are brutal in terms of overcrowding, lack of food, resources, bad sanitation on both sides. But on the Southern Confederate side, it's a little bit worse because, as you'll see in the next lecture, the South is having difficulty distributing and delivering food even to its own civilians, let alone prisoners of war. The worst POW camp that at least we know of was a Confederate POW camp at Andersville, or I should say, Confederate-run POW camp at Andersonville in southern Georgia, where some 45,000 prisoners were herded into an open field with just a single creek running through it and encircled by this palisade fence. Soldiers, prisoners would have to defecate, wash, and drink and cook with the same water. And of course, disease and death from exposure very quickly begins to run rampant through this camp. And 1 out of 3 will die in Andersonville. And the camp at Andersonville is very much reminiscent of Nazi open-air POW camps for Soviet soldiers, which were not given the kind of protections under the Geneva Convention for how to treat prisoners in the way, for example, American or British or French soldiers received from the Nazis for various political, racial policies that the Nazis had implemented. And Andersonville pretty much resembles one of those camps. Here you can see an actual photograph of Andersonville and the condition in which the Union prisoners are kept in it. Here again, you can see a photograph taken from the wall of the camp, and there's here's the palisade, and then you can see this wall, which is this kind of fencing, which will be nicknamed the deadline. And if you cross the deadline, then you're automatically shot by guards who are up on top of the palisade wall. And again, reminiscent of scenes in Nazi concentration camps, many prisoners just commit suicide by deliberately walking across the deadline. A total of 13,000 POWs will die at Andersonville, mostly from malnutrition and disease. As I say, one in 3. When you look at the photographs of survivors from the Andersonville POW camp, you can see that they're in a condition very much reminiscent of World War II concentration camp inmate survivors as well. They're barely managing to stay alive in a serious condition of malnutrition and starvation and disease. After the war, there will be probably the first war crime trial in the United States. Henry Wirtz, the commander of Andersonville, will be tried by court-martial on charges of war crimes. His defense is one that is familiar to us. Quote, "I was only following orders." And of course, it's already during his war crime trial way back in 1865 that the precedent is set that following illegal orders by a commander makes him culpable in accusations of war criminality. In other words, it is the duty of any officer or soldier to disobey an illegal command. And that's the principle in the military to this day, despite how difficult it is for a soldier in the field to one's given an order to kind of distinguish whether that particular order is illegal or not under all sorts of military disciplinary threats. But nonetheless, that's the principle. It's established that I was only following orders is not a defense. And so November 10th, 1865, Wirtz will be hanged in Washington, just outside the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. And so again, we can see aspects of total war beginning to raise its head in this Civil War. A few days later, after the Battle of Cold Harbor, Grant continues on his drive to surround Richmond and Petersburg. And after several more battles there, he finally begins to dig in south of Richmond, bypassing it essentially, and focusing on the town of Petersburg, which is south of Richmond. He kind of bypasses Richmond and begins to encircle both Petersburg and Richmond by siege. And again, this is essentially the last phase of the war, the Richmond-Petersburg campaign, or the siege of Petersburg, will begin June 15th, 1864, with Union forces digging in, and will continue into March of 1865, when the lines at Petersburg will eventually collapse, and both Petersburg and Richmond will end up being evacuated by the Confederates. But 1865, we're talking in the last weeks of the war. That's how long it will take for the Union to take out Richmond, a mere 100 miles south of Washington, D.C. The nature of this fighting now is, again, very much beginning to foreshadow the First World War. Trenches, siege guns, kind of a no man's land, a war of attrition, stagnation, each side sometimes capturing 100 yards and then losing it the next day, but no kind of definitive resolution. And so this trench warfare, again, very much foreshadowing the trench warfare of the First World War, is beginning to characterize the nature of the war. And of course, the Union, with its superior population, with its superior industrial might, is more capable of sustaining this kind of war of attrition as opposed to the Confederacy, whose lines are beginning to thin. And so at this point, it's now approaching the 1-year anniversary mark of Gettysburg. And when Northerners calmly begin to assess where they were a year earlier and where a year later now the Union Army stood at the gates of Richmond, even with the slow and costly going, many feel that progress has been made. And if no reverses occur again, victory was in sight for the Union. And that is to the credit of Lincoln's dogged leadership. And so it very much looks now that Lincoln's renomination for a second term as a presidential candidate is a done deal in the Republican Party. And indeed, June 7th, 1864, Republican convention is convened in Baltimore, Maryland, and Lincoln is nominated, much to the displeasure, of course, of Jefferson Davis in the Confederacy. And Jefferson Davis, of course, he would not face re-election as president for another 2 years, as the Confederate Constitution calls for a presidential term of 6 years, as opposed to the Union one that back then and still today has a 4-year term for the president. So this is indeed bad news for Jefferson Davis, the renomination of Lincoln. He had hoped for a more moderate Republican candidate, but in fact, he's going to hope that a Democratic Party candidate, in particularly a peace Democrat, peace at any cost Democrat, will not only be nominated by the Democratic Party, but will prevail. But in the meantime, Lincoln's nomination is bad news for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. And not only that, the convention now makes the news even worse. They declare as their plank the so-called third resolution. Quote, resolved that as slavery was the cause and now constituted the strength of this rebellion, we demand its utter and complete extirpation from the soil of the Republic. We are in favor, furthermore, of a constitutional amendment to forever prohibit the existence of slavery in the United States. End of quote. This is how long it took the Republican Party and Lincoln's administration to actually make the abolition of slavery as a plank in the Republican Party platform. As vice president, the convention nominates a former congressman and Southerner, Tennessee Governor Andrew Johnson, a pro-Union Southerner and a pro-war Democrat. And it's a good choice. It's a smart choice to balance and unify all the political parties and factions to back Lincoln's Republicans. Around the same time, towards the end of June, Lincoln's cabinet now is going to undergo a major upheaval. And again, it's going to be around the figure of his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. Lincoln is receiving complaints from New York Republican politicians that Salmon Chase is appointing customs officials in New York from Democratic Party supporters and radical faction supporters of his own bid for the presidency. And of course, as Secretary of the Treasury, this is a power that Chase has, the appointment of customs inspectors. Lincoln now asks Chase to consult on future appointments in New York with the politicians before making them. Chase ignores Lincoln's request and instead continues to appoint objectionable candidates to the customs post, which Lincoln is required to sign off on to make official. When Chase appoints a supporter with no experience in that post, Lincoln now tells Chase that he will not approve that nominee and would he kindly go back, consult with the politicians in New York, and find another mutually agreeable nominee to the post. Lincoln now sits and waits. And of course, Chase does what he did before. He now fires off his fourth letter of resignation to Lincoln and assumes that Lincoln, as before, will either back off or compromise or come to some kind of agreement with Chase or deal, and continues his daily workday at the Treasury Department. To Chase's shock, the next day, Lincoln sends the name of a new nominee for the Treasury, for the post of Treasury Secretary, and accepts Chase's resignation. Chase is actually shocked because he didn't even know that Lincoln had actually accepted his resignation. Chase's supporters now lobby Lincoln to reconsider, but he, of course, is determined to get rid of Chase now. And he shows the supporters the previous three offers to resign that Chase had submitted, and he explains, quote, Mr. Chase had a full right to indulge in his ambitions to be president, end of quote, but that his friends and allies have so poisoned relations between him and Chase that they could hardly bear to meet. So with all due respect, Lincoln says to Salmon P. Chase, I'm this time accepting his resignation. It's a bit of a search to find a replacement for Salmon P. Chase. And here you can see a cartoon from that period, Mr. Lincoln. Mike, remove the salmon and bring me a Todd. Salmon and Todd are kind of fish. Mike, the Todd's out, but I can fix something else, sir. And indeed, eventually, Lincoln will choose William Pitt Fessenden to replace Chase, an anti-slavery senator from Maine who is a radical and has radical Republican support. And as well, he's very well qualified for the role of Secretary of the Treasury, as Fessenden was the chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance. Salmon P. Chase himself will be appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when Justice Taney passes away. And it's a kind of a backhanded slap, but Salmon P. Chase's portrait will be featured on one of the denominations in U.S. currency, the $10,000 bill. I don't think anybody has ever had a $10,000 bill in their wallet, but essentially the $10,000 bill was for transporting or paying out huge amounts of money, agency to agency or government, bank to bank, and so forth. And so the higher the denomination, the less the honor, because less people will actually see your face. And so I don't think there's any denomination higher than $10,000. This, I'm sure they're not printing $10,000 notes anymore, as now money can be, transferred digitally and so forth. But that's the honor that Salmon P. Chase will get, his picture on the $10,000 note. I think he's the only, until recently, the only non-president, how they call American money, dead presidents. I think is the only non-president who is featured on any American currency, other than I think now Susan B. Anthony is as well featured on that. And there's talks of other historical figures, non-presidential figures. Before Congress adjourns for the summer in July of 1864, Lincoln is in a battle with radicals when they pass a very punitive Reconstruction bill that radically differs from Lincoln's formula for bringing back Southern states into the Union after the war. Lincoln's plan is very lenient, and he hopes by this leniency to, in a way, demoralize the Confederacy, as he offers rebel states readmission back into the Union even before the fighting has ended if only 10% of a state's citizens take an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. The Congressional Reconstruction Bill tightens those conditions. Fighting would now have to cease first, and a majority of state citizens would now have to swear allegiance before that state can be readmitted. Lincoln manages to sabotage the bill using what's known as kind of a loophole in the presidential veto power. It's known as a pocket veto. This is kind of a way a president can avoid maybe being embarrassed or being attacked for vetoing a particular bill, or forcing a attempt in Congress. Remember, a presidential veto can be overridden by a 2/3 majority in Congress, right? And so how the pocket veto works is the president doesn't exactly veto the bill, but he fails to sign it before Congress adjourns. And then the bill dies. It has to be reintroduced again and go through all the processes that congressional legislation goes through. And it's kind of like Lincoln saying, I really wanted to sign this bill, but I forgot it in the trunk of my car, and sorry, I didn't get to it before Congress adjourns. Otherwise, I would have signed it. I'm all for it. We'll take it up when Congress returns again after the election. We'll deal with it, or when Congress returns in the fall, we'll start the debate on the bill again. So it's as I say, the pocket veto is a tactic, and it's a kind of a loophole in the whole veto process that can sometimes bypass a veto without embarrassing the executive. July 5th, there's still evidence of danger from the Confederates. Robert E. Lee's army once again attempts now to move north and this time attack Washington directly. The reason is once again to attempt to lure General Grant's troops away from Petersburg. And on July 9th, General Lew Wallace, eventually the author of Ben-Hur, manages to hold off the attack on Washington in this day-long battle at Monocacy River in Washington. So Lew Wallace essentially saves Washington that day. By now, Washington, D.C. is probably the most heavily fortified city in the world. And of course, the Confederate attack will be blunted by July 11th with a heavily reinforced movement of the Union Army. But it doesn't bode well, again, for Lincoln, this narrow escape of a raid or an attack on Washington so late in the war, which reveals the Confederates, despite the fact that they're, beginning to go down on one knee and are crumbling slowly but steadily. Nonetheless, the Confederates still at this point in the summer of 1864 proved themselves to be a potentially dangerous enemy. Grant, in the meantime, now wants to desperately break through Petersburg. And so July 30th, we're going to have the Battle of the Crater. It's a scene that is vividly portrayed in the opening of the movie Cold Mountain. Sappers and former coal miners dig this T-shaped tunnel underneath the Confederate defense line, and they lay some 8,000 pounds of explosives along a 75-foot length of the tunnel, and then they hard pack the tunnel with tons of earth. Black regiments of infantry are trained to attack the blast by fanning out around the crater when it's created by the blast and break through the lines of surviving Confederate soldiers. It's a kind of almost a blitzkrieg tactic, a breakthrough tactic. At the last minute, though, General Burnside, who's in command of this operation, replaces the black troops with untrained white regiments. The reasons are not clear exactly. Either Burnside is under political pressure and in a lack of confidence in the plan doesn't want to risk high casualties in, again, African-American units, not to discourage African-Americans from enlisting in the army, or the inverse, maybe Burnside didn't like the racial implications if it is African-American troops that lead the attack that turns the war around. When the blast goes off, it opens up a 30-foot deep crater in the ground and instantly kills several hundred Confederates. But then, when the untrained white troops attack, not knowing any better, rather than going around the crater, they feel that it's safer for them to seek cover inside the crater as they advance. And once they descend into the crater, they become trapped and mired in the muck created by the water table of the crater. And so the Confederates, as portrayed in that movie, there you can see the crater shortly after the battle. As you see in the movie, cold mountain, the Confederates now line up along the edge of the crater and begin to massacre all the Union troops stuck in the mud below them. Like, as they say, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. At the so-called Battle of the Crater, 5,300 Union casualties to 1,032 Confederate casualties. And so again, it's not going well for Grant or Lincoln, despite these kinds of advances. They're sporadic, and the casualties are rapidly mounting. We're not sure what Lincoln is thinking at this moment, but many of those close to him are disillusioned. Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, says it left him depressed. Quote, less, however, from the result, bad as it is, than from an awakening apprehension that Grant is not equal to the position assigned him. A blight and sadness comes over me like a dark shadow when I dwell on the subject, a melancholy feeling of the past, a foreboding of the future. Grant was indeed the fifth or sixth general to be put in command of the Army of the Potomac. I say fifth or sixth because McClellan is fired once, but then he's reinstated. And so it seems that Grant is not doing any better than the previous generals. The Army of the Potomac is cursed, and it seems the Army is a guarantee for failure and disgrace for any of its commanders. Lincoln, those dark summer days of 1864, continues to show faith in Grant and his strategy. Indeed, Grant is not only the commander of the Army of the Potomac, but he's in charge of the entire national military strategy, a sweeping plan that now involves his friend General Sherman to attack into the heart of the South through Atlanta, and several other forces to attack from the west through the Shenandoah Valley, while Grant would focus on finishing off Richmond. The United States Army is now the biggest in the world, but none of the required victories to proceed with Grant's final plan are forthcoming. And the North in August is becoming despondent over the death and casualties that are sweeping through every community like a tidal wave. One can even argue both the North and South are now despondent. The South, despite its tenuous victories, does not see any immediate relief to the threat other than an election that will elect a peace candidate in the North. The South continues to see a slow nibbling away of its territories, a gradual encirclement of the Deep South, a probing of by the Union at the gates of Atlanta. It just doesn't look good for the South, and there is this longing for compromise with the South at any cost, as you can see in this cartoon, including the inscription on the tombstone, "In memory, Union forces killed in a useless war." And again, often this is becoming about what the term will be abolitionizing the war, that this war to end secession and reconstruct the United States as of Lincoln's proclamation, January 1st, 1863, had become a war about abolition, abolitionizing it. And it seriously makes Lincoln, certainly in those years of 63 and into 64, one of the most hated presidents in American history. I mean, compared to Trump, Lincoln is hated, I think, much more deeply than Trump might be today. And certainly Lincoln doesn't have the kind of adherence of loyal supporters that Trump still holds today. Nothing of that sort. And so Lincoln's re-election essentially will be more about who the opposition to Lincoln is rather than Lincoln himself. That August of 1864, the Democratic Party now is going to hold its convention in Chicago. And it looks like that General George T. McClellan, Little Mac, or Little George, as he was sometimes nicknamed, is going to be nominated to run against Lincoln. And there are all these calls for negotiated peace treaty with the South. McClellan, of course, is actually very popular and especially popular with his troops, while kind of people concerned with the war effort may criticize McClellan's slow-moving, timid style of command. His troops love him for it because it keeps them out of combat. And so George McClellan begins to look like the likely candidate to be appointed by a Democratic Party that is going to adopt a peace resolution. Let's make peace with the Confederacy, let them keep their slaves, let's reunite the United States the way it was before. Essentially, it will be the Democratic Party platform. Lincoln, in this period himself, is believing that his political future was at risk, if not that of the Union as well. He's worried that if his presidency doesn't prevail for a second term, the next president may just settle for peace at any cost, and the United States will become two countries, the United States and the Confederate States of America, two separate countries, and it will be the end of everything that the American Revolution stood for and all its achievement, the end of the United States as it was known in those days. And so Lincoln feels that his future is at risk if he continues to pursue this war with no apparent turn towards success. Lincoln is warned by his advisors that, quote, the people were wild for peace, end of quote, and that soon the Democratic Party convention would very likely nominate the very popular George McClellan. Moreover, McClellan's popularity with Union troops is also significant because this is the first time that U.S. Army personnel will be allowed to vote in the field. Union troops who are not at home can vote wherever they're stationed. And so everyone assumes that this is going to be radically favorable to George McClellan, particularly by soldier voters in the Army of the Potomac. So McClellan and Democrats appear to be a serious challenge to Lincoln's upcoming November election. Complicating things is there seem to be at the same time peace feelers extending from the neutral exile capital of the Confederacy in Niagara Falls, Canada. Here, there is a kind of exile Confederate delegation, a kind of ambassador ship just across the Niagara River from the United States, from New York State. The Confederates are housed in the Clifton House Hotel at that time, one of the largest tourist hotels in Niagara Falls, which is already by then certainly has always been a tourist destination. Horace, and so from here, there are rumors emerging that at Niagara Falls, there's a delegation there ready to negotiate a peace agreement and a treaty with the Union to end this war. Horace Greeley, the powerful editor of the Republican Party's quasi-official newspaper, the New York Tribune, and one of the original founders of the Republican Party. And remember, the same individual who sabotaged William Seward's run for the Republican nomination back in 1860 receives word now that 2 ambassadors have been sent by Jefferson Davis to Niagara Falls, Canada, and are empowered to negotiate a peace treaty. Greeley urges Lincoln to negotiate with them. He writes, quote, "Our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying country also longs for peace, shudders at the prospect of fresh conscriptions, of further wholesale devastations, and of new rivers of human blood. And a widespread conviction that the government is not anxious for peace and does not improve preferred opportunities to achieve it is doing great harm." End of quote. Some historians characterize Lincoln's position towards the South as being that of unconditional surrender, a term, again, that we often associate with total war. In fact, it's not true. Lincoln will correctly suspect that the ambassadors in Niagara Falls are not actually accredited by Jefferson Davis. But just the same, he now commissions Greeley to go to Niagara Falls and meet with them all the same and to bring them back to Washington if they're agreeable to 2 conditions. 1, the restoration of the Union. 2, the abandonment of slavery. And so in his famous "To Whom It May Concern" letter, or the so-called Niagara Falls Declaration, which Lincoln forwards to Horace Greeley to read to the Confederate ambassadors at Niagara Falls, Lincoln writes, quote, "To whom it may concern, any proposition which embraces the restoration of peace, the integrity of the whole Union, and the abandonment of slavery will be met by liberal terms on other substantial and collateral points." End of quotes. So this is not a call for unconditional surrender, but to the South. This is tantamount to, quote, unconditional submission, the exact words that Jefferson Davis uses in response to the Niagara Falls Declaration. And indeed, just as Lincoln had suspected, the delegates at Niagara Falls had no authority from Jefferson Davis to negotiate. And now Lincoln attempts to use this to show that it is not he who was at fault for the lack of peace negotiations, but the Confederacy. For once, the Confederates managed to outfox Lincoln and turn this whole affair into a propaganda victory against Lincoln by claiming falsely that the negotiations at Niagara Falls collapsed only because of Lincoln's insistence on the abolition of slavery. This, of course, once again reminds Northerners that they're dying only for the freedom of slaves. But for this issue of slaves, all other issues were negotiable. That's essentially the propaganda message that is reinforced by the Confederacy. And so Republicans are joining in their condemnation of Lincoln, including members of his own cabinet. Several members of his cabinet tell Lincoln outright that he had no chance of winning the election, and that there was grumbling in the Republican Party that perhaps they might have to have another convention to nominate a peace alternative candidate. And so, on top of that, the Democratic Party was about to clearly nominate McClellan on a peace platform, which further seems to guarantee that Lincoln would not be reelected. Lincoln now digs in his heels. He is probably believing that he may not be reelected. And so he turns his attention to what he could do for slaves before he ends up being thrown out of office. Lincoln toys with the idea of sending African American secret agents into the Confederacy to ferment slave rebellions. We have no evidence that this plan was actually implemented, but we don't really know what exactly happened with that plan, how far it went. Lincoln, in fact, begins to even more stubbornly resist. He now expands his 2 conditions to 3 conditions by the end of 1864. There will be no peace without 1, an immediate and permanent cessation of hostilities, 2, reconstruction of the Union, and 3, complete and total abolition of slavery. In other words, the first condition, a new condition, the third condition is that the Confederacy has to lay down their arms, not necessarily surrender, but there has to be a permanent cessation of hostility. There will be no peace negotiations while the 2 sides are fighting. And we see Lincoln here now in for the fight to the death, not only for his own reelection, but what he saw was as a fight to save the existence of the United States and its Constitution. As August is coming to an end, Lincoln makes this passionate speech to an Ohio regiment returning home from the front and passing in review by the White House. He tells them, quote, "I happen temporarily to occupy this big White House. I am a living witness that any one of your children may come here as my father's child has. It is in order that each of you may have, through this free government which we have enjoyed, an open field and fair chance for your industry, enterprise, and intelligence, that you may all have equal privileges in the race of life, with all its desirable human aspirations. It is for this the struggle should be maintained, that we may not lose our birthright. The nation is worth fighting for to secure such an inestimable jewel. August 29th, the Democratic Party convention in Chicago finally begins. While the Democrats enjoyed watching the Republican Party split and divided between radical and Union Republicans, the Democratic Party itself is also divided between war Democrats who called for dropping emancipation, but the continuation of the war until the Union has been reconstructed, and peace Democrats who were calling for immediate peace at any cost, even if the Confederacy will never return to the United States. The Democratic Convention will nominate war Democrat George McClellan as their candidate. But they will declare a at any cost peace platform as the official policy and electoral platform of the Democratic Party. And this, of course, now threatens to divide the Democratic Party. It's also a problem for McClellan, since he's now going to be the Republican Party candidate. His position is he is prepared to continue war to bring the Union, to bring the Confederacy back into the Union, but he won't pursue this war over the abolition of slavery. But the official party platform is peace, end this war for under any conditions, including, as I say, recognizing Confederate sovereignty. And so McClellan is going to have to make a choice, as now the Democratic Party finds itself being torn apart. Everyone is expecting McClellan to win this election. He is the front runner in everybody's opinion. But as this cartoon points out, an old story newly applied, say peace, or by thunder, I'll split it up the middle. All this is going to be a huge problem when McClellan is actually nominated. Now, McClellan has this difficult choice, whether to accept the nomination to run as president, leading a party that is supporting a peace platform, while he himself is, however, a war Democrat. How would that work? And it couldn't come for McClellan at a worse time. And McClellan will now do what he does so well: nothing. McClellan will now lock himself in his hotel room and refuse to go before the convention and either accept or reject the nomination, refuse the nomination. He's got to go one way or the other, and he's doing nothing, just sitting there, just as he did at Rich Mountain, just as he did in the early years after the Battle of Manassas, just as he did in the Overland Campaign against Richmond. McClellan now is doing this politically. And it, as I say, it couldn't come at a worse time. as he needs to make this kind of decision. Which way is he going to go? Is he going to surrender his war platform, or is he going to just refuse to be president and run as a candidate for a party with the peace platform? It couldn't come at a worse time because, of course, 3 days later, William Tecumseh Sherman probably saves Lincoln's presidency, September 3rd, 1864. He breaks the 40-day siege of Atlanta as Confederate troops retreat from Atlanta. Sherman's army begins to occupy it. And as the New York Times reports, Atlanta is ours. The foundries, furnaces, factories of cannon and small arms, of powder, cartridges, and percussion caps, of gun carriages, wagons, ambulances, harnesses, shoes, and clothing, which have been accumulated at Atlanta, are now ours. End of quote. Mayor James Calhoun surrenders Atlanta to General Henry Slocum. Sherman will arrive 5 days later, and on September 7th, Sherman orders all civilians in Atlanta to leave. About 3,000 civilians from Atlanta's original population, and maybe 19,000 refugees who had as well assembled in Atlanta. September 11, Mayor Calhoun appeals Sherman's decision on humanitarian grounds, and the following day, Sherman will respond, quote, "The use of Atlanta for warlike purposes is inconsistent with its character as a home for families. There will be no manufacturers, commerce, or agriculture here." End of quote. Sherman gives civilians 10 days to leave Atlanta in whichever direction, north or south, east or west, they want to take. And Sherman's army now moves into the emptied Atlanta houses and buildings, takes them over, and will now live there for the next 2 months, waiting for the results of the presidential election coming in November. This news of the fall of Atlanta, of course, changes everything for McClellan. He has to make that decision now, whether to accept or refuse the nomination. And so September 9th, McClellan will make a public declaration accepting the nomination to run as the Democratic presidential candidate. He begins by acknowledging the importance of the peace Democrats, but he says peace had been possible as long as the war had been conducted for the sole purpose of preserving the Union. But now, since this war has been abolitionized, it's too late for peace at any cost. He will continue the war, he says, unless the South re-enters the Union, with or without their slaves. And so he explains it. He says, quote, "I could not look in the face of my gallant comrades of the Army and Navy who have survived so many bloody battles and tell them that their labors and the sacrifice of so many of our slain and wounded brethren had been in vain." The peace Democrats now have no choice. And so the Democratic Party will yield now to their war Democrat presidential candidate. The Democrats accept the position that they will continue now the war until the Union is remade, and that will be the only non-negotiable term. There has to be a reconstruction of the Union. This kind of puts Lincoln into a slightly better position now. The South, in the meantime, of course, is seriously demoralized, because now they realize that it doesn't matter who wins the election, whether the Democrats win or the Republicans win, no matter what, no matter who wins the election, the war will continue until their secession and rebellion is suppressed and the Confederacy is dragged back into the Union. This is bad news, as I say, for Jefferson Davis. November 8th, Lincoln wins by over 400,000 popular votes, and it easily clinches an electoral majority this time. Several states, as I say, allow their citizens serving as soldiers in the field to cast ballots, the first time in American history. And much to the surprise of everybody, soldiers in the Union Army give Lincoln more than 70% of their vote. Lincoln, unlike the last election where he had a minority in the popular vote, wins 55% of the popular vote. Compare that to the 40% back in 1860. Of course, 1864 election, the South is not there to skew the national popular vote the way it was in 1860. So that kind of also will account for the resounding victory for Lincoln in the North. In the congressional elections, Union Republicans, as the conservatives become known, gain 18 seats in the House. And so Lincoln allies are now well seated in Congress. Lincoln clearly has a mandate for another 4 years. And now, after all the troubles he's had, he's fighting mad. He's ready now to end this war in any way possible. So, long Abraham Lincoln, a little longer, is the cartoon that appears in American press after the election. 3 days after Lincoln's election, on November 11th, Sherman orders Atlanta to be burned to the ground in preparation for his march southeast through Georgia to Savannah on the Atlantic coast, the notorious Sherman's March to the Sea, or Sherman's March. After a plea by Father Thomas O'Reilly of the Immaculate Conception Church, a Catholic church in Atlanta, Sherman chooses not to burn the city's churches and hospitals. The rest of Atlanta, of course, is destroyed before Sherman's troops leave on their destructive march. Everything will be destroyed along the way. And again, I would argue here, if one chooses to argue that the Civil War was a total war, this kind of focus on industrial infrastructure, on civilians as targets, even if lethal force is not being used against them, might be an argument for the Civil War being a total war. So it's not necessarily so. It depends on you as a historian to kind of again argue this with evidence, but it's very compelling, that argument that the Civil War is total war. Everything, as I say, is destroyed along the way. Soldiers pull up railway tracks and then they heat them and they bend them over a bonfire. And of course, this, you would have to completely melt down the entire iron track at this point. You can't just heat it up and straighten it out again. So this kind of bending of railway tracks become nicknamed as Sherman's neckties. In fact, that's General Sherman standing there looking at one of his Sherman's neckties. The march, as I had described in a previous lecture, will take almost 2 months, nearly 2 months, as all communications is cut off from Sherman's army as he goes on a march. In fact, he vanishes. Nobody knows where Sherman is until around Christmas time. He pops up in Savannah and now declares the capture of Savannah as a Christmas present for the president. Christmas present for the president. That's how Sherman calls it. So how much Lincoln's election and Lincoln's orders to Sherman are involved in this, what, as I say, in the South is still regarded as a war crime today, is a question. And it's unlikely that Sherman would have undertaken this radical new destructive strategy without Lincoln's approval. This kind of burning destruction of everything along the way. And so it too begins to make the landscape look very much like the landscape of total war, in the way villages in Belgium, in France looked during the First World War, in the rest of Europe during the Second World War. This kind of ruin is not an aspect of wars previously. Napoleonic wars were often fought on fields away from civilian populations and cities, but this now has become this all-encompassing war. And Lincoln, we know Lincoln is capable of ruthlessness. As we saw, Lincoln was capable of suspending habeas corpus, and he was just barely talked out of arresting the Supreme Court Chief Justice Taney. And so when we look at Lincoln, the dollar bill Lincoln, the kind of good Lincoln that comes from this lithograph, and then we look at the photograph on which this Lincoln is based, we can almost see two different Lincolns. We kind of see the propaganda Lincoln, and then we see kind of a more hardened, what I refer to as Planet of the Apes Lincoln, the warrior, the one ready to burn down a city and order his general to expel all the citizens out of it, or at least allow his general to do so. And so Lincoln is now certainly tired, desperate to finish this war. There's a lot of weight on Lincoln at this point in time. Certainly the timing of the burning of Atlanta, Sherman just sits there waiting, as I say, for the election to take place until he sets fire to the city. For Jefferson Davis, as I say, he's got 2 more years to go on his presidency, but Jefferson Davis now realizes that the outcome of the election is going to change nothing. And so Jefferson Davis now will launch a series of guerrilla-type raids into Union territories designed to demoralize the Union on the eve of the election. Lincoln is now faced with a Confederacy that will respond to Sherman's claim that he's bringing the war to the Confederates back home to remind them how terrible war is. Jefferson Davis is going to do the same in a campaign reminiscent of modern day guerrilla operations or even terrorist actions. In fact, before the election already, because once those candidates are nominated, Jefferson Davis realizes that this is, that there will be no candidate elected that will guarantee end of fighting. The Confederacy is going to have to go on. So on October 14th, 1864, the Confederates will launch their deepest raid into Union territory by attacking from Canada, from across the Canadian border at Quebec into St. Albans, Vermont. A troop of Confederate cavalrymen are assembled in Canada in the guise of vacationing hunters. And they slowly trickle across in civilian dress across the border into Canada. They assemble on the Quebec border, and then they ride across the border into St. Albans. And they break out into 3 units. They simultaneously rob 3 banks in the town of St. Albans, carrying away over $200,000 in negotiable bonds and gold currency. They kill 1 townsperson, they wound another, and then they attempt to set the town on fire. But in that, they fail. And then they turn back towards Canada. And on the way, somewhere near the US-Canadian border, they bury St. Albans gold, which treasure hunters are still seeking to this day. It had never been found. Canadian authorities managed to capture 11 of them. They're arrested. They're held in custody in Montreal, and the Union demands their extradition now to stand trial in Vermont on criminal charges. Canadians, women in particular, will knit gloves and scarves for these Confederate raiders, which Canadians are very sympathetic for. The raiders claim that they're not criminals, that they're soldiers acting on orders of the Confederate government, and they had committed no violation in Canada. And eventually, a sympathetic Canadian judge will discharge the prisoners on a technicality, claiming that their arrest warrants were improperly filled out, and this will begin souring relations between the U.S. and Canada once again, certainly since the Trent crises. In a way, the Trent crises ruins relations based on kind of British issues with the Union at that point over the seizure of the postal steamer, the Trent. But in this case, it's directly Canadian territory that's involved. And this is not the only operation that the Confederates are trying to carry out in Canadian territory to strike at American provinces bordering on the Canadian territory. On the west end of Lake Erie, Confederates attempt a maritime raid from Canada by attacking a U.S. Navy vessel guarding Johnson's Island, which held on Lake Erie some 2,500 Confederate POWs. The ship that is supposed to be used to attack the ship that's protecting the Union American ship that's protecting the POW Camp Island is bought secretly by a Canadian working with the Confederacy, a prominent figure in Toronto, George Dennison III. I'll talk about him in a second. The U.S. intelligence agents will eventually identify this ship, the Georgian, which is bought here in Canada. It's repaired, I think, in Collingwood and fitted with torpedoes that are built secretly by the Confederates in a hidden factory not far from Ryerson, actually, on the corner of Dundas and Bay Streets. That is where those torpedoes are produced. And then this ship is fitted out, as I say, somewhere up in Collingwood, and then it's supposed to be sailed out to Lake Erie eventually. And Canadian authorities seize the ship at this point at the request of Washington. And so we know about George Dennison's role in Confederate operations from Canada by virtue of Dennison, then, who put up the money for the ship. He will then sue the Canadian government for the return of this ship seized. And so it's all on the record, essentially, in Dennison's suit, which he fails to get his money back out of this ship. But the result of all this is now the U.S. revokes the historic Rush-Bagot Treaty, which was concluded after the War of 1812, way back in 1817, which banned the presence of armed naval vessels on the Great Lakes. The U.S. now deploys gunboats along the Great Lakes for the first time since the War of 1812. Shortly after the War of 1812, the U.S. will withdraw those armed vessels. And again, it's confirmed by the 1817 Rush-Bagot Treaty. But the U.S. will reintroduce, for the first time since then, those armed vessels on the Great Lakes in 2004, when armed Coast Guard gunboats are deployed under George Bush's Homeland Security Initiative along Lake Erie and Lake Huron. The other thing, also very hauntingly similar to recent changes in U.S.-Canadian border security, was now the demand of passport controls on the border. Canadians could no longer just cross into the U.S. with, without a passport, and of course we ourselves, up until the 2000s, were able to just cross into the U.S. border by showing a driver's license. You didn't have to have proof of nationality or a passport the way you do now. These are all measures kind of since the War on Terror began, these new measures and the restricted U.S.-Canadian border. The other thing it leads to, of course, in Canada is the founding of Canada's first Secret Service, the Canada West Frontier Constabulary under stipendiary magistrate McMicken. The point of this Secret Service civilian plainclothes investigators is to identify Confederate operatives operating in Canada threatening to strike into the United States. Because what Lincoln essentially tells now the Canadians is that if you don't protect the border from Confederate incursions from your side, we will have to do it for you. And that, once again, is a threat that the Union Army now might be invading Canada. And certainly at this point, the Union campaign is in much better condition to deal with a two-front war if in fact, they're going to deal with Canada. So once again, Canadians are once more rearming and upping their militia training and getting ready possibly for, once again, a invasion from the United States into Canada, as might have occurred during the Trent crisis in 1861-62. The Confederate presence in Canada is substantial. It consists at least of 1,000 agents, commissioners, representatives, operatives, lobbyists, businessmen, exporters, plainclothes soldiers, and secret agents, along with their Canadian supporters, of which there are many, and they're undertaking all sorts of activities, both open and clandestine. Support for the Confederates runs deep in Canada, with Canada's very deeply historic traditional suspicion of republicanism. In fact, in mid-19th century Canada, republicanism is regarded here the way we might have regarded communism during the Cold War, or the way we might look at Islamic radicalism today as a kind of a threat to the values of Canadian society. And so many, particularly former United Empire loyalists and their descendants, see a kind of a kinship with the Confederacy and kind of the plantation society of the Confederacy, as well. We here in Canada are less industrialized and are looking to the industrialized United States south of us as much as a kind of a threat as agrarian society and planters are looking at it in the South. So our viewpoints on the Union and its society and the nature of its industrialized society is very much eye to eye the same as the Confederacy has, as per to our, again, seminar readings, the first set of seminar readings. The Confederate Canadian headquarters, as I say, was at Clifton House Hotel in Niagara Falls, just across the river. In Toronto, Confederate agents are hosted at their Canadian supporters compound. The Dennison family is one of the most powerful and richest Toronto families or Ontario families in the 19th century. The Ontario archives store their locks of hair like saintly kind of relics. This is George T. Dennison II, the father of George T. Dennison III, who financed the building of that ship. George T. Dennison III is a agent for the Confederate Secret Service. In fact, he's got an uncle down in the United States who is as well a senior figure in the U.S. in the Confederate Secret Service. Dennison's wife Mary, for example, the two of them will host Confederate agents here in their home in Toronto. The wife will sew secret messages and dispatches written on handkerchiefs into the sleeves of these agents, who are then sent across the border. The idea of sewing these messages on handkerchiefs is of course, if you're searched, you may feel paper, kind of crunching under your hand as you search someone or in their pocket. But a handkerchief sewn into the sleeve of a jacket, of course, a hand search will not detect that, because the kind of textile nature of a handkerchief sewn into a textile coat. So it's a great way, I think, of smuggling messages. Even today, you would have to, the person you're searching would have to remove their jacket, their shirt, and so forth, their pants, and turn the sleeves or the trouser legs inside out to see if there's anything sewn on the inside. So very few are going to conduct that thorough of a search. So it's an interesting way of smuggling messages that is viable to this day. Again, metal detectors are not going to detect that either. So George T. Dennison the third is a colonel in the Canadian military at the same time as he is working for the Confederates. Again, his family has these deep connections to the United Empire Royalists. The entire family, in fact, will be the largest land owners in Ontario in the mid-19th century, and they'll own great swaths of land in Toronto. They have the monopoly on paving all the roads in Toronto. They're incredibly rich. And his grandfather, way around the War of 1812, actually forms his own cavalry regiment that by the 1850s is an official regiment in the Canadian militia system, in the defense system, and remains functioning today. And George Dennison III, he'll be something like 19 years old or 20 years old. He's a law student in Toronto. He'll become the commander of this regiment, all along, as I say, as while serving the Confederate Secret Service. The regiment is still active today. The Governor General's Horse Guards, they escort royalty on visits to Canada. The Dennison family is also, of course, the founders of the Queen's Plate horse race. And so, again, whenever the Queen's Plate horse race is held, it's kind of inaugurated by the Governor General's Horse Guard. This, of course, is a ceremonial guard now. During the Second World War, this regiment, of course, became an armored regiment. And the regiment today is an armored reconnaissance regiment still in service. There's one squadron of horses, and the soldiers who ride those horses actually own those horses. So they're kind of, privileged members of society. And, it's kind of hard to own a horse unless you got the stabling for it and so forth. But it is a ceremonial part of the regiment. But the rest of the governor general's horse guard are this armored reconnaissance unit. In fact, this is the unit that I served in when I was a teenager. It's a lot of fun. Not a lot of marching or walking, but a lot of driving and shooting and off-road driving. So I certainly, as I say, enjoyed serving in the Governor General's Horse Guard, and they're always looking for recruits. So it's nice pay. You get all sorts of bonuses. So there you go. If you're interested, you want to have some fun, call Sergeant Jesus Castillo. The unit is based in Downsview at the Dennison III Armory, named for him on 1 Yukon Lane. So still in service today. George Dennison will also become, this prominent figure in Canadian military politics. He will, during the Civil War, serve as an alderman in Toronto. He'll sit on city council. And in fact, when Lincoln is assassinated, city council sends a telegram of condolences to Washington. George Dennison refuses to add his name to the telegram of condolences. He is so pro-Confederacy. He'll live into the 20th century, George Dennison. He'll become a police magistrate in Toronto. He'll author this book, among many other books, on cavalry tactics. He'll win a prize from the Tsar of Russia for his manual on cavalry. So the Fighting Dennisons essentially are Canada's premier military family. They'll produce an admiral in the British Navy as well, and many Canadian officers, as I say, senior officers come from the Dennison family. They have their own private cemetery today in Weston, just overlooking the Humber River near Lawrence and Jane Street. So you kind of go up Jane Street, turn left on Lawrence, and you should be able to find in the back of some housing complexes this old cemetery where the Dennisons are all buried like soldiers on parade by rank. In fact, the oldest grave there goes back to 1812. The Fighting Dennisons. So, this is a prominent family, and they are hosting actively Confederate agents in their compound. Their compound, this is the gates to it on Dundas Street, was around the corner of Dundas and Dovercourt. In fact, they owned all this land between Dufferin and Dovercourt College and Dundas Street. This was their family ranch and compound. They raised horses here. They had plantations here. And that's part of the reasons the streets are all kind of strange and end in dead ends, and there are little hillsides here. If you explore this neighborhood, essentially it used to be owned by the Dennison family, and they had like I said, their family villas there, and eventually they built housing on it. So, as I say, very deeply suited a deeply seated Canadian family, super pro-Confederate, to the point, as I say, that they're hosting Confederate Secret Service agents and financing Confederate operations into the United States. After the war ends, the president, Jefferson Davis, will send his presidential papers to George Dennison in Toronto. And the Confederate presidential papers will be housed in a safety deposit box at the Bank of Montreal until Jefferson Davis, after the war, once it's decided that he won't be tried, arrives in Toronto to pick up his papers. And there's a huge welcoming parade of Torontonians led by George Dennison meeting Jefferson Davis when he arrives at the Toronto ferry docks. And part of his memoirs, Jefferson Davis will write in Niagara on the Lake, where many Confederates who were working here in Canada or who didn't want to remain in the United States, fearing that they might be arrested and tried for treason. Eventually, there was a small Confederate community in Niagara on the Lake until they eventually felt safe enough to return to the United States, or some return, go live elsewhere. So Dennison traveled often to the Confederacy. Dennison was a personal friend of Robert E. Lee. After the war, Dennison and his wife often vacationed with Robert E. Lee. Some of the Confederates moved on to Cuba, and again, George Dennison would have vacationed with them in Cuba as well. So our Canadian roots with the Confederacy, as I say, are deep. Operating here as a Secret Service agent as well is John Wilkes Booth, the future assassin and an actor, the future assassin of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, there is some evidence that Booth at first had hoped to kidnap Lincoln prior to the election, and it's only later that this kidnapping plot becomes an assassination plot. And part of the plot might have been plotted here in Canada. After the assassination of Lincoln, there are investigations here in Canada to the connections between Canadians and the Lincoln assassination and support for John Wilkes Booth. The other thing that the Americans do as well, November 25th, after the election, Confederate terrorist cells, and there's no other word for it, infiltrate New York City in civilian clothing, and they plant 402 incendiary bombs throughout the city. Some operatives check into hotels. They then pile their room furniture up against the walls and curtains and set these incendiaries to ignite all at the same times. They'll strike at venues where the public gathers. They manage to, for example, burn down the P.T. Barnum Museum. They set fire to several hotels. But unlike the New York draft riots the previous year, this time the New York Fire Department responds to the fires. And so most of the fires are suppressed, and this Confederate attempt to burn New York City down, kind of in revenge to what was done a few weeks earlier at Atlanta, fails. And of course, making matters worse, for the crises in Canadian-American relations at that time, these operatives, and I think terrorists is an appropriate word for what this was. These Confederate operatives manage to escape from New York north up across the Canadian border, where they once again vanish in Canada and are protected by Canadians. So certainly, if the Civil War never quite lived up to our contemporary notion of what total war is, I think there's very little doubt that had the war gone on any longer, it inevitably would have become total in our current modern sense of that war, total war.